I'm going to save you some real grief today with this little tip from me, Keith Wilson. This is something that's innate in human nature. You do it, I do it every day, probably every week at least. And this is what happens. I'm working with a leadership board that's struggling with this right now. They found out some new information that they just didn't have about some things that are going on in the organization. They hadn't seen it before. It's information they had but hadn't looked really deeply into. And when they got into it, they realized that some things weren't as good as they should be. And they got really frustrated. And here's what everybody in the room did at the same time, really, whether internally or externally. They said, well, that's so-and-so's responsibility, right? They should be doing so-and-so or blank. What they did as soon as they found out about this issue was they went like this. Who can I point my finger at? It's called blaming other people. We almost always do it in human nature. It goes back to the beginning of time. I won't even get into all of that. But when something isn't good, and there's any sense that maybe, and to me, if I start to blame somebody, I know that I'm feeling some type of responsibility in it. Because I don't blame somebody if I have zero responsibility. If I find out that somebody, did something that I don't have any role in, then I'm probably not going to be like, well, you should have, right? That blame is some type of self-admission that I have a role in this thing in some way. And in this leadership situation, they should have been holding more accountability around several of these issues, and they were not. And I'll tell you where I learned this really well. My daughter, who just turned 10. She was 9 at the time. We had some friends over, a bunch of friends, kids playing in the basement, and a little boy comes up from downstairs and he's crying and he's sad. This is a great illustration I use with leadership teams all the time. And he says, Mommy, Sophie pushed me. And he's crying. And is at that moment as a parent where all the parents raise up because some kid's crying and they hear the story and then they turn towards you and it's like, and my wife even goes, that's your conversation to have. Oh gosh. And the reason I get this oh gosh in me is because Sophie is she's our tough one. She's the one who will kick her brother and knock him down and wrestle with him and the other girls won't. And she's the one to, express a little anger at times. And so instantly it's like, oh, if somebody was going to push, one of those kids down there was going to push the 4-year-old, it was probably Sophie. So I start to walk to the top of the steps and on the way I'm thinking, Sophie, you need to And I held off judgment. I reserved my judgment for a minute. And I swallowed it and I opened the door and I said, Sophie, she came to the bottom of the steps. Grant came upstairs and he was crying. She said, he was? I said, yeah. And I said, what happened? And she said, what do you mean? And all of a sudden you see all these other dozen kids start to gather around it's like sharks. One of us is getting in trouble. We want to be there to witness it. As long as it's not me, I want to be front and center. These kids kind of come around her and I said, well, he was crying and he said that you pushed him. And she goes, me? I said, yeah. And she said, I pushed him in the swing. So we had the swing hanging in our basement, just like from the outdoor swing set. I hung one there 10 years ago. The kids love it and they can swing, especially in the cold parts of the year. The kids are swinging in it. And this little boy said, well, somebody swing me, and nobody would do it. Sophie went over and said, I'll push you. She picks him up, puts him in the swing, and she pushes him for a few minutes. And one of the other girls said, well, Sophie pushed him in the swing. And I said, well, then why was he crying? And they said, well, he wanted to continue swinging and nobody wanted to keep pushing him and Sophie wanted to play something else after a couple of minutes. Okay. So the story is that Sophie was the first one to respond and help you out and push you, and then she didn't want to push you anymore, and now you're sad about that. Totally get it. If I would have come down on her right away from the place that I wanted to, point at you thing, I would have been completely off base. That's often what happens in our teams and in our lives in general. I talked to a great guy recently who is an organizational development guy, works for Indiana Wesleyan and at a big company here in Cincinnati for quite a while. And he said that there's a recent study that showed that 81% of employee issues and problems with employees were not exclusively the employees' things. It was usually an environment thing. the resources they had at their disposal, the instruction they had, the things that were given to them set them up to fail or succeed. That 81% of the time, when we wanted to point the finger at a person, it was usually a problem in the organization. 81% of the time. That says to me, we have to do a lot better job of reserving judgment when we find out about issues. We can't jump to pointing the finger. It is human nature, but we have to pause. Instead of saying, that's so-and-so's responsibility, they should be doing blah. It's, well, that's so-and-so's responsibility. Let's ask them to give us some input on this and leave it at that. Because as soon as I blame, I'm admitting that I've made a value judgment about what's happened and that I know what's going on when I don't even have any of the information. And I've seen a couple of leaders and a leadership team recently almost lose both limbs to that landmine because they didn't want to reserve judgment, and we were able to convince them to, and it saved a ton of grief. So reserve judgment, go talk to people and find out, and start with this question. We noticed that this is going on. What don't you have in order to deal with that issue or this problem? How have I not helped you? What can I do to better help you? And start with what we can own in it and give people the chance to respond and see how that goes. And make sure that it's not something that you frankly own before you come down on somebody. Great tip, can save you a ton of energy and trouble if you will reserve judgment and not blame and shame to start off a conversation and swirl on that thing. So, love to help you guys do more awesome work. We do a ton of work where we're facilitating a lot of conflict resolution things in organizations. We kind of do this hard work stuff when you're not sure where to go and what to do and how to have those conversations. We love to help facilitate those. So if you feel like you can do this on your own, then great, more power to you. If you'd like some help with some tough situations or some tough employees or a conversation like that you just don't feel like you're equipped to handle, we would love to help you do that. Check us out at www.goinceptus.com. That's INCEPTUS.com. So we can help you do more awesome work, but go get to it. Thank you.